The rain came down in relentless sheets, soaking the streets of Chicago in a cold embrace. Thunder growled low in the distance, and the city's pulse seemed to quicken as pedestrians scurried for shelter. Amidst the chaos, Oliver Harrington sat in the back seat of his luxury sedan, his gaze fixed on the shimmering raindrops racing down the tinted windows. His driver navigated the congested streets, and the hum of classical music filled the cabin, a stark contrast to the cacophony outside. Yet, Oliver felt no comfort. His phone vibrated on the leather seat beside him. A quick glance revealed a series of notifications from his assistant, Vanessa, reminding him of an upcoming meeting with investors. Another deal, another opportunity to expand his empire. Yet tonight, something gnawed at him, a weight he couldn't shake. As the car idled at a red light near Grant Park, his attention was drawn to a figure huddled on a bench under a flickering street lamp. A woman sat alone, wrapped in a threadbare coat that seemed woefully inadequate against the biting wind. Her auburn hair clung to her face in damp strands, and in her hands she clutched a small object, a locket perhaps. Oliver couldn't see her eyes clearly, but there was something about the way she sat, as if defying the world even in her vulnerability, that made him pause. "Pull over," Oliver said suddenly, his voice cutting through the soft melody in the car. The driver hesitated. "Sir, the area—" "Just pull over," Oliver repeated, already opening the door before the car fully stopped. The rain greeted him with icy determination as he stepped out, the fine wool of his coat quickly becoming heavy and sodden. The woman didn't react as he approached. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze fixed on a puddle at her feet. It was only when his shadow loomed over her that she looked up, her piercing blue eyes meeting his. They were hollow, guarded, yet unmistakably defiant. "You shouldn't be out here," Oliver said, his voice soft yet firm. "The rain's freezing." "And where exactly should I be?" she shot back, her tone sharp, her lips curling into a faint smirk. "In your fancy penthouse, sipping champagne?" Her sarcasm caught him off guard, but it didn't deter him. "Look, I just thought you could use some help," he offered. "A warm meal, maybe a—" "I don't need your charity," she interrupted, her grip on the locket tightening. "I've gotten this far without anyone's help." Oliver crouched slightly, leveling his gaze with hers. "Sometimes, it's okay to let someone in." For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the rhythmic patter of rain. Her eyes searched his, as if trying to decipher his intentions. Then she shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You don't know anything about me," she said quietly. "And you wouldn't understand, even if I told you." "Then let me try," Oliver said, surprising even himself with the sincerity in his voice. The honk of a horn startled them both. Oliver glanced back to see his driver motioning impatiently. He sighed, pulling a business card from his pocket and placing it on the bench beside her. "If you ever change your mind," he said, straightening up. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the card, as he walked back to the car. The door shut with a soft thud, and as the car pulled away, Oliver found himself watching her in the rearview mirror until she disappeared from sight. That night, in the quiet solitude of his penthouse, Oliver couldn't shake the image of her soaked figure, her defiant eyes. He poured himself a glass of scotch, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Below him, Chicago buzzed with life, oblivious to the small mysteries it held, like the woman in the rain, Grace Donovan. He didn't know her name yet, but something told him that tonight was only the beginning. The storm had passed, leaving Chicago cloaked in a misty chill that clung to its streets and skyscrapers. The city's relentless rhythm returned with the morning light, as if the rain had never interrupted its pulse. In the Harrington Tower penthouse, Oliver stared into his untouched cup of coffee. The skyline stretched out before him, its grandeur muted by the weight on his mind. He'd barely slept, haunted by the image of the woman from the park. Her defiance and vulnerability lingered like a ghost, intruding on his thoughts. Who was she? What had brought her to such a desperate place? He tried to brush it off, as a passing curiosity, but the nagging feeling wouldn't let go. "Mr. Harrington?" Vanessa's voice interrupted his reverie as she entered the room. Clad in a sharp gray suit, his assistant carried a tablet stacked with updates. "The morning briefing is ready. You're due at the investors' luncheon in an hour." Oliver waved a hand dismissively. "Reschedule it." Vanessa blinked, momentarily thrown off by his uncharacteristic response. "Sir, this is a critical meeting for the upcoming product launch. Investors are flying in." "I said reschedule." Oliver cut her off, his voice calm but firm. "Something's come up." She didn't press further, though her expression betrayed her unease. "Very well, I'll notify the team." With a click of her heels, she left him to his thoughts, though not without a wary glance over her shoulder. Meanwhile, across town, Grace Donovan sat in the corner of a bustling diner, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The warmth seeped into her frozen fingers as she stared out at the gray streets. She had managed to scrape together enough change for the drink, but couldn't bring herself to eat. Hunger gnawed at her, but it was nothing compared to the bitterness that curled in her chest. Her reflection in the rain-streaked window mocked her. Once, she had walked these streets with confidence, her portfolio of sketches under her arm, and her dreams of an art career burning bright. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. Now, she was just another invisible figure in the city's shadows, surviving one cold night at a time. As she adjusted the locket around her neck, a relic of a family she barely spoke of anymore, the door jingled open. She didn't bother to look up. People came and went, their lives carrying on, as hers stood still. "Still don't need help?" a familiar voice asked, cutting through the din of the diner. Her head snapped up. Standing before her, with rain-slicked hair and an expensive overcoat, was the man from the park, Oliver Harrington. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone sharp. The last thing she needed was someone prying into her life. "Checking if you're okay," Oliver replied evenly, unbothered by her icy demeanor. "I told you last night. I'm fine." She glanced pointedly at the door. "You can go now." But Oliver didn't move. Instead, he slid into the booth across from her. The rich scent of his cologne mingled with the diner's greasy air. Grace tensed, her fingers tightening around the locket. "You don't look fine," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "And if I'm honest, I can't stop thinking about why." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Look, I don't know what you're after, but I don't need saving. I've made it this far on my own." Oliver studied her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe you don't need saving," he said. "But everyone needs a little help sometimes." She scoffed, but her fingers betrayed her, tracing the locket's smooth surface. "Why do you care?" "I don't know yet," Oliver admitted. "But I'd like to find out." Grace leaned back, folding her arms. "Rich guy swoops in to save the poor girl. How cliché." "Then don't think of it that way," Oliver countered, leaning forward slightly. "Think of it as two strangers crossing paths." Their eyes locked, and for the first time, Grace felt the weight of his sincerity. She hated the small part of herself that wanted to believe him. Oliver reached into his coat and pulled out a brown paper bag. He placed it on the table between them. "It's just food," he said. "No strings attached." Grace hesitated before taking the bag. The aroma of a fresh sandwich made her stomach clench painfully, but she refused to show how much she needed it. Instead, she nodded curtly, "Thanks." As she ate in silence, Oliver watched her with quiet curiosity. She could feel his gaze, and it unnerved her. No one had looked at her like that in years, not with pity, but with genuine interest. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "I used to think I'd never end up like this." Oliver tilted his head. "What happened?" Grace's hand brushed the locket again, but she didn't answer. Instead, she stood, clutching the paper bag. "Thanks for the food, but this is where our paths uncross." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out into the misty streets. Oliver didn't stop her, but as he watched her disappear into the crowd, he knew this wouldn't be the last time he sought her out. Back at his penthouse, Oliver found himself staring at the locket, sketched hastily in his notebook, a detail he'd noticed hanging from Grace's neck. There was a story there, he was sure of it, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt compelled to uncover it. "Vanessa," he called, grabbing his phone. "I need you to clear my schedule for the next few days." Vanessa's exasperation was palpable, even over the phone. "Sir, may I ask what's going on?" "You can ask," Oliver said, already stepping out onto his balcony to clear his mind. "But I don't think I'll have an answer for you." Meanwhile, Grace retreated to her makeshift shelter, a forgotten corner beneath an overpass. She unwrapped the sandwich slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be her last. Her mind replayed Oliver's words, his persistent gaze, and the strange warmth she felt when he spoke to her. She shook her head, willing herself to push it all aside. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not anymore. As the night deepened, Grace clutched her locket tightly, her thoughts drifting to the life she'd left behind. The family that had betrayed her, the home she'd lost, and the dreams she'd abandoned. Somewhere in the city, a billionaire lay awake, haunted by a woman he barely knew. And somewhere beneath the stars, that woman fought to survive another night, unaware that her world was on the cusp of irrevocable change. Chicago hummed with its usual intensity as Oliver Harrington strode into the sleek lobby of Harrington Tower. The polished marble floors reflected his brisk steps, but his mind was far from the world of billion-dollar deals. Vanessa, ever punctual, appeared beside him, tablet in hand, and her expression as sharp as her tailored suit. "Your lunch meeting with the board is set for noon," she began, keeping pace with him. "I've also rescheduled the investor luncheon for tomorrow, as requested." "But sir, about yesterday, not now." Oliver cut her off, his tone clipped, but distracted. Vanessa's mouth pressed into a thin line, though she said nothing further. She had worked for Oliver long enough to recognize when he was preoccupied, but even she couldn't ignore the growing whispers among the staff. Whispers about his unusual behavior, his frequent absences, and his uncharacteristic silence during meetings. As Oliver entered his office, the sprawling view of the Chicago skyline greeted him, a constant reminder of his achievements. But for the first time, it felt like a hollow victory. His gaze fell on the corner of his desk, where a sketch lay, a rough drawing of the locket Grace had worn. It was a small, ornate piece, yet it seemed to carry a weight far beyond its size. He picked up the sketch, studying it, as if the answers to his questions might appear in the intricate lines. Who was Grace Donovan? What story lay behind her guarded eyes and sharp words? He didn't know why he cared so much, but he couldn't shake the feeling that meeting her had been anything but coincidence. Across town, Grace woke to the sound of the city coming alive. Her makeshift shelter under the overpass was a far cry from comfort, but it was hers, a fragile sanctuary in a world that had long since turned its back on her. She pulled her threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders, shivering as the morning chill seeped through the concrete. The paper bag Oliver had given her sat nearby, the remnants of last night's meal still in it. She stared at it for a moment, before pushing it aside. Accepting help, even something as simple as a sandwich, felt like a defeat, a reminder of how far she had fallen. But as she stepped into the bustling streets, she couldn't ignore the flicker of warmth she'd felt during their brief conversation. There was something different about him, something she couldn't quite place. Not pity, not charity, but curiosity? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. People like Oliver Harrington didn't care about people like her. Not really. By late afternoon, Oliver found himself back in the park, where he had first encountered Grace. The rain-soaked bench was empty, and a pang of disappointment settled in his chest. He turned to leave, but a flash of auburn hair caught his eye. Grace stood a few feet away, rummaging through a worn backpack. "You came back," he said, his voice cutting through the din of the park. Grace stiffened, turning slowly to face him. Her expression was a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "What is this? Your new hobby?" she quipped. "Stalking homeless people?" Oliver ignored her jab, taking a step closer. "I wanted to see how you were doing." "Well, now you've seen," she retorted, crossing her arms. "Satisfied?" "Not really," he admitted. "How about you let me buy you a real meal this time?" Grace's eyes narrowed. "Why? So you can feel better about yourself?" "No," Oliver said simply. "Because I want to." His sincerity caught her off guard, and for a moment she hesitated, but her pride, ever her fiercest defender, refused to yield. "I don't need your help," she said firmly. "Maybe not," Oliver replied, "but everyone needs someone." Grace opened her mouth to argue but stopped. There was something disarming about his persistence, something that made her want to trust him against her better judgment. Finally she sighed. "Fine. One meal. But after that we're done." Oliver smiled, gesturing toward a nearby diner. "Deal." Over plates of warm food and steaming coffee, Grace found herself lowering her guard, ever so slightly. It was hard not to when faced with someone who seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. "So," Oliver began, leaning back in his seat, "how does someone like you end up here?" Grace bristled at the question. "Someone like me?" "I didn't mean it that way," he said quickly. "I just meant, you don't seem like someone who gives up easily." She studied him for a moment, deciding how much to reveal. "Life doesn't always give you a choice," she said finally. "Sometimes it takes everything before you even know what's happening." Oliver nodded, sensing the weight behind her words. "And your family? Don't they help?" Grace's expression darkened, and she looked away. "Not everyone has a family worth leaning on." The locket around her neck glinted in the light, drawing Oliver's attention. "That," he said, nodding toward it, "seems important." Grace's hand instinctively covered the locket. "It's just a keepsake," she said tersely. "Nothing you'd care about." Oliver didn't press further, though his curiosity deepened. There was more to Grace Donovan than she was letting on, and he intended to find out what. Back at Harrington Tower, Vanessa cornered Oliver as he exited the elevator. "We need to talk," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "About?" "About whatever's been distracting you," Vanessa said. "The staff has noticed. The board is asking questions, and frankly, so am I." "Is this about a woman?" Oliver raised an eyebrow. "Why would you think that?" Vanessa folded her arms. "Because you've been acting like a man who's either in love or in trouble." "Which is it?" "Neither," Oliver said evenly, though the corners of his mouth twitched. "I'll handle it, Vanessa." Just trust me. She sighed, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to push further. Fine. But if this affects the company, it won't, Oliver assured her, though a small voice in the back of his mind wondered if that was true. For Grace, the evening brought a rare sense of calm. She sat on the edge of her shelter, sketchbook in hand, her pencil moving almost unconsciously. The lines took shape, forming an image she hadn't drawn in years, a grand estate with ivy-covered walls and towering windows. Her hand paused as memories surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. "Why do you keep haunting me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Far away in the safety of his penthouse, Oliver stared out at the city lights, his thoughts once again drifting to Grace. There was something about her, a puzzle he felt compelled to solve, and for the first time in years, he found himself wondering if he was finally chasing something that mattered. The first cold snap of winter had settled over Chicago, painting the city in shades of gray. Grace Donovan pulled her tattered coat tighter around her as she navigated the crowded streets, her breath visible in the frigid air. Her usual resilience felt dulled, her body weakened by days of hunger and sleepless nights. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she pressed on, refusing to let the city's indifference break her. Across town, Oliver Harrington stood in front of a towering window in his penthouse, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The expansive view of the city offered no solace, his mind consumed with thoughts of Grace. He'd barely focused on his work in days, the image of her weary yet defiant eyes haunting him. Something about her had stirred a part of him he thought he'd long since buried, a part that cared deeply about more than quarterly reports and profit margins. Grace's steps faltered as a wave of dizziness hit her. She braced herself against a lamppost, the world spinning around her. A passerby shot her a glance, but kept walking, their indifference cutting deeper than any insult. She needed rest, food, and warmth, but pride and stubbornness had kept her from seeking help. Her pride, however, wouldn't save her now. A few blocks away, Oliver was in his car, idling at a red light. He hadn't planned to return to the park, but his thoughts and a nagging sense of responsibility had driven him there once again. He scanned the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of her fiery auburn hair. Just as the light turned green, he saw her slumped against the base of a lamppost, her body unnaturally still. His chest tightened. He pulled over hastily, ignoring the angry honks of drivers behind him. "Grace!" he called, as he ran to her side. She didn't respond, her head lolling slightly as he crouched down. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. "Stay with me," Oliver muttered, slipping his arms beneath her frail frame. She was lighter than he expected, a reminder of how fragile her situation truly was. Ignoring the curious stares of onlookers, he carried her to his car and sped toward the nearest hospital. The sterile white walls of the emergency room felt oppressive as Oliver paced back and forth, waiting for news. A nurse finally emerged, her expression professional but kind. "She's malnourished and severely dehydrated," the nurse explained. "We've started IV fluids and are monitoring her vitals. She'll need rest and proper nutrition to recover." Oliver nodded, his relief tempered by concern. "Can I see her?" The nurse hesitated before nodding. "She's awake, but try not to overwhelm her." Grace's hospital room was small and dimly lit, the steady beeping of monitors breaking the silence. She looked up as Oliver entered, her eyes narrowing. What are you doing here?" she croaked, her voice weak but laced with irritation. "I could ask you the same thing," Oliver replied, pulling a chair to her bedside. "But I think I already know the answer." Grace turned her face away, her cheeks flushing with a mix of shame and frustration. I didn't ask for your help. No, Oliver said softly, but you needed it. Her hands clenched the thin hospital blanket as she glared at him. What do you want from me? Gratitude? A story to tell your rich friends? I want you to get better, he said, his tone steady but firm. And I want to help you, whether you like it or not. Grace's anger ebbed, replaced by a weariness she couldn't hide. Why? She whispered. Why do you care? Because I do, Oliver said simply. And you're just going to have to deal with that. Discharge papers in hand, Oliver drove Grace to his penthouse, ignoring her half-hearted protests along the way. This isn't permanent, he assured her, as the elevator ascended to the top floor. Just until you're back on your feet. Grace stepped into the sprawling space, her eyes widening despite herself. The modern furnishings, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the breathtaking view. It was everything her life wasn't. She hovered near the door, her worn boots leaving faint smudges on the pristine floor. I can't stay here, she said, her voice tight. This isn't me. It's just a place to rest, Oliver said, setting her bag down by the guest room door. You don't have to like it. You just have to use it. She hesitated, her pride warring with her exhaustion. Finally, she relented, crossing the threshold into the guest room. The bed, with its soft linens and downy pillows, beckoned her. She sank onto it cautiously, the unfamiliar comfort almost overwhelming. I'll leave you to rest, Oliver said from the doorway. But if you need anything, just let me know. Grace didn't respond, her eyes already closing as sleep claimed her. The following days were a test of patience for both of them. Grace struggled to accept Oliver's generosity, her pride bristling every time he offered her something. A meal, clothes, even a book to pass the time. Meanwhile, Oliver grappled with his own feelings, torn between wanting to help her and respecting her independence. One evening, he noticed her sitting by the window, a sketch pad on her lap. The faint scratch of pencil against paper filled the quiet room. He approached cautiously, his curiosity piqued. May I? He asked, nodding toward the sketch pad. Grace hesitated before flipping it closed. It's nothing. It didn't look like nothing, Oliver said, sitting across from her. You're an artist? I was, she admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. Before everything. Oliver leaned forward, his interest genuine. What happened? Grace's grip on the sketchpad tightened. Life, she said simply, offering no further explanation. That night, Oliver found himself in his study, staring at the sketch she'd hidden. It was a rough drawing of an estate, grand and imposing, with ivy-covered walls and ornate windows. It looked like something out of a storybook, yet the lines carried an undeniable weight of memory. He thought about asking her, but something told him she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he resolved to be patient. Grace Donovan was a puzzle he intended to piece together, one careful step at a time. Across the city, the tabloids had caught wind of Oliver's unusual house guest. Grainy photos of Grace, leaving the hospital with him, had sparked a media frenzy. Headlines speculated wildly, painting her as everything from a mysterious new flame to a gold-digging scam artist. When Vanessa brought the articles to his attention, Oliver's jaw tightened. Ignore them, he said curtly. Oliver, Vanessa pressed. This could damage your reputation. The board won't like it. I don't care what the board likes, he snapped. This is my life, not theirs. As the days turned into weeks, Grace began to settle into a tentative rhythm. She sketched more often, her lines becoming bolder and more confident. Oliver, true to his word, gave her space while quietly supporting her in ways she couldn't yet see. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Grace looked up from her plate. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked, her tone softer than before. Oliver met her gaze, his expression earnest. "Because I believe in you, Grace, even if you don't believe in yourself yet." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was right. The winter sun cast a pale, diffused light across Chicago, bouncing off the glass skyscrapers and muted city streets. Within Oliver Harrington's penthouse, the atmosphere was unusually serene. Grace Donovan sat cross-legged on the plush carpet in the living room, a blank canvas propped up in front of her. The silence was broken only by the gentle scratching of pencil against paper as she sketched, her brows furrowed in concentration. Oliver watched from the kitchen, his coffee forgotten in his hands. He had seen glimpses of Grace's talent before, but today there was a quiet intensity to her movements that held him transfixed. The sketch came to life with every stroke, a bustling market scene, its details vivid, yet tinged with an ethereal quality. The figures seemed to dance across the page, each one alive with untold stories. He crossed the room slowly, not wanting to disturb her. "That's incredible," he said softly, his voice breaking the spell. Grace startled, quickly flipping the sketchpad closed. "It's just something I was working on," she muttered, her tone guarded. "Don't downplay it," Oliver said, sitting across from her. "You've got real talent, Grace," she shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "Doesn't mean much these days." "It could mean everything," he countered. "Have you ever thought about selling your work?" Grace let out a bitter laugh. "And who would buy it? No one wants art from someone like me." Oliver leaned forward, his expression earnest. "You're underestimating yourself? Talent like yours doesn't go unnoticed for long." She wanted to believe him, but years of disappointment and rejection had taught her otherwise. Instead of answering, she turned the conversation back on him. "Why do you even care so much?" Oliver hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Because I see potential in you," he said finally, "and I don't want to see it go to waste." Grace didn't respond, but the faintest flicker of gratitude passed over her face before she returned to her sketchpad. As the days passed, Grace's sketches began to fill the once empty corners of the penthouse. Oliver encouraged her to display her work, even going as far as purchasing supplies, a set of watercolors, brushes, and premium paper. At first, she resisted, reluctant to accept what she saw as charity, but his quiet persistence wore her down. "You can't keep pushing away everyone who wants to help you," Oliver said one evening, as he handed her a pristine box of paints. "At some point, you have to let someone in." Grace hesitated, her fingers brushing over the box. "It's not that simple," she said quietly. "Letting people in usually means getting hurt." "Not always," Oliver replied, his tone gentle. "Sometimes it means finding someone who'll stand by you, no matter what." One afternoon, as Grace sorted through her sketches, Oliver noticed a particular drawing, a grand estate, its ivy-covered walls and stately columns, rendered with remarkable detail. The image struck a chord with him, not just for its beauty, but for the emotion it seemed to carry. "Where is this?" he asked, holding up the sketch. Grace stiffened, her expression guarded. "It's just something from memory." "It looks personal," Oliver pressed, his curiosity piqued. She hesitated before answering. "It was my family's home, a long time ago." Oliver sensed the weight behind her words, but chose not to push further. "It's stunning," he said instead, placing the sketch carefully back among the others. "You should be proud." Grace nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. The estate she had drawn wasn't just a memory. It was a symbol of everything she had lost. Her father's legacy, her family's pride. It had all been taken from her, in a series of betrayals she rarely allowed herself to dwell on. Meanwhile, Oliver's world outside the penthouse was anything but calm. Tabloid headlines continued to swirl, speculating wildly about his connection to the mystery woman living under his roof. His assistant, Vanessa, had taken to screening his calls to shield him from the more outlandish rumors. "You can't ignore this forever," Vanessa said one morning, dropping a stack of glossy magazines onto his desk. Each cover bore a variation of the same sensational headline: Tech Mogul and His Gold-Digging Muse. Oliver barely glanced at them. "Let them talk," he said dismissively. "It's not just the media," Vanessa pressed. "The board is starting to ask questions. They're worried this could affect investor confidence." "Then they'll have to deal with it," Oliver said firmly. "This is my life, Vanessa, not theirs." Vanessa sighed, knowing better than to argue when he was this resolute. "Just be careful," she said finally, "for both your sakes." Back at the penthouse, Grace was unaware of the storm brewing outside. Her focus remained on her art, which had become both an escape and a lifeline. One evening, Oliver joined her in the living room, carrying a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "I thought we could use a break," he said, pouring a glass for each of them. Grace accepted hers reluctantly, swirling the liquid before taking a cautious sip. "Is this your way of bribing me into staying?" "Not exactly," Oliver said with a faint smile, "but I wouldn't mind if it worked." For the first time since moving in, Grace allowed herself to relax. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from their favorite books to their most embarrassing childhood memories. Oliver shared stories of growing up in foster care, his voice softening as he spoke about the challenges that had shaped him. "You don't strike me as someone who's had a hard life," Grace said, studying him. "You seem untouchable." Oliver chuckled, though there was little humor in it. "Trust me, I've had my share of struggles. They just don't show on the surface anymore." Grace nodded, her respect for him deepening. "I guess we're more alike than I thought." As the night wore on, Oliver brought up the idea of holding an art show for Grace. "Think about it," he said. "You could showcase your work, maybe even sell a few pieces." Grace shook her head vehemently. Absolutely not." "Why not?" Oliver asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because I'm not ready," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "And because I don't want to be a charity case." "This isn't charity," Oliver insisted. "It's about showing the world what you're capable of." Grace hesitated, torn between fear and the faintest flicker of hope. "I'll think about it," she said finally, though her tone was non-committal. That night, as she lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, Grace couldn't stop thinking about Oliver's words. Could she really step into the spotlight after years of hiding in the shadows? The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. In the living room, Oliver sat with her sketch of the estate in his hands. He didn't know the full story behind it yet, but he was determined to find out. Grace Donovan was a mystery he intended to solve, not out of curiosity, but because he cared deeply about the woman she was and the potential he saw in her. Little did they know, their worlds were about to collide in ways neither of them could have anticipated, setting the stage for the challenges and revelations yet to come. The Chicago morning buzzed with its usual chaotic rhythm, but within the walls of Oliver Harrington's penthouse, the tension was anything but ordinary. The city's tabloids had found their latest muse, and her name was Grace Donovan. Grace woke up to the soft hum of traffic outside, a momentary illusion of normalcy, before reality came crashing in. As she entered the living room, she noticed Oliver sitting at the breakfast bar, his face obscured by a newspaper. The headline screamed back at her. Tech mogul's mystery woman. Gold digger or charity case. What is that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Oliver lowered the paper, his expression unreadable. They've found out about you. Grace's chest tightened. How? I've barely stepped outside. They're vultures, Oliver said, setting the paper down with a sharp motion. It only takes one photo, and a slow news cycle. The photo in question was splashed across every media outlet. Grace, leaving Oliver's building late one evening, her disheveled appearance and guarded expression feeding into the media's narrative. They're painting you as some kind of charity project, Grace said, her voice trembling with anger and shame. That's not who you are, Oliver replied firmly, and I'm not going to let them define you that way. The fallout was swift and brutal. Social media buzzed with a mix of speculation and judgment. Some commenters ridiculed Grace, while others lambasted Oliver for what they perceived as a lapse in judgment. Within hours, the Gold Digger Gate trended across platforms, and the tabloids ran with it. Back at Harrington Enterprises, Oliver's assistant Vanessa confronted him in his office. She held a tablet displaying yet another inflammatory article. This is spiraling out of control, she said. The board is demanding a meeting. They're concerned about how this is affecting investor confidence. Investor confidence? Oliver repeated, his tone sharp. Since when does my personal life have anything to do with the company's bottom line? Since you became the face of the brand, Vanessa replied. You've built an empire on your image, and now that image is being dragged through the mud. Oliver clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to lash out. I'm not abandoning her, he said firmly. So, if the board has a problem with that, they can take it up with me directly. Vanessa sighed, her tone softening. Just be careful, Oliver. You can't save everyone. This isn't about saving her, he said. It's about standing by what's right. At the penthouse, Grace paced the living room, the weight of the headlines pressing down on her. I should leave, she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Oliver, who had just walked in from the office, froze. What are you talking about? This, she gestured to the tabloids, scattered across the coffee table. Isn't worth it. I'm not worth it. Don't you dare say that. Oliver snapped, his voice uncharacteristically harsh. This isn't your fault, Grace. Maybe not, she replied, her voice cracking. But it's still happening because of me. Oliver crossed the room, his expression softening as he placed a hand on her shoulder. I don't care what they say. I care about what's true. And the truth is, you're not what they're making you out to be. Grace shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. I can't be the reason your life falls apart. You're not, Oliver said firmly. And you won't be. But if you run now, you're letting them win. Determined to shift the narrative, Oliver decided to take matters into his own hands. Despite Vanessa's warnings and the board's protests, he scheduled a press conference. The media room at Harrington Enterprises was packed with reporters, their cameras trained on the podium. Oliver stepped up, his expression calm but resolute. I know there's been a lot of speculation about my personal life recently, he began, and I want to set the record straight. The room buzzed with anticipation. Yes, Grace Donovan is staying with me. And yes, she has faced unimaginable challenges. But she is not the caricature the media has made her out to be. She's a talented artist, a resilient survivor, and someone who deserves far more than judgment from people who don't know her. A reporter raised a hand. Mr. Harrington, are you romantically involved with Miss Donovan? Oliver met the question head on. I'm involved in helping someone who has shown me what true strength looks like. And if that's a problem for anyone, so be it. The press conference sent shockwaves through the media. Some outlets lauded Oliver's courage, while others doubled down on their criticism. The board remained uneasy, but public opinion began to shift. Online, a growing number of voices came to Grace's defense, sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. At the penthouse, Grace watched the press conference replay on TV. When Oliver returned home, she met him at the door. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice quiet. "Yes, I did," Oliver replied, "because you deserve better than what they're giving you." For the first time, Grace felt a flicker of hope, fragile but undeniable. In the days that followed, Grace channeled her emotions into her art. She began working on a series of paintings that captured her journey. Moments of despair, resilience, and newfound hope. Oliver arranged for her to meet with a gallery owner, but Grace hesitated. "What if no one likes my work?" she asked. "They will," Oliver said. "But even if they don't, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're sharing your voice." Reluctantly, she agreed, and the gallery visit became a turning point. The owner was impressed, not just by her talent, but by the raw emotion her pieces conveyed. "These aren't just paintings," the owner said. "They're stories, and people need to see them." As the chapter came to a close, Grace stood on the balcony of Oliver's penthouse, gazing out at the city lights. The wind tugged at her hair, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of possibility. Oliver joined her, handing her a mug of tea. "You've come a long way," he said. "So have you," Grace replied, a small smile playing on her lips. They stood in silence, side by side, their connection deepening with each shared moment. Despite the challenges they faced, they both knew they were stronger together. The atmosphere in the penthouse was unusually calm. Grace had found solace in her art, her confidence growing with each sketch. Oliver, ever supportive, had been giving her space while working to keep the board placated after the media frenzy. But their peace was about to shatter. One rainy afternoon, the building's concierge called up. Mr. Mason Donovan is requesting to see Miss Donovan," the voice announced. Grace froze at the mention of the name. Her grip on the sketchpad tightened, her knuckles white. "Mason?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who is he?" Oliver asked, noting the tension in her posture. "My brother," Grace said, her tone heavy with a mix of surprise and bitterness. Oliver studied her face. "Do you want to see him?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. "I need to know why he's here." Minutes later, Mason entered the penthouse. Tall and impeccably dressed, he exuded the polished charm of someone used to getting his way. But Grace wasn't fooled. She crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "What do you want, Mason?" she demanded. Mason raised his hands in mock surrender. "Is that how you greet family, Gracie?" "You stopped being family when you sold me out," she retorted. "Get to the point." Mason's smile faltered, and he adopted a more serious tone. "I came to make amends, and to tell you something you need to hear." Mason began his tale, weaving a story that left Grace reeling. Their late father's art empire, which she thought had been dissolved and sold off piece by piece, had been stolen in a fraudulent takeover, orchestrated by none other than Mason himself, alongside powerful corporate interests. "I didn't know the extent of what was happening," Mason said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But it's not too late, Grace. You can reclaim what's rightfully yours." Oliver, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. "And why the sudden change of heart? What's in it for you?" Mason hesitated, then sighed. "I'm not proud of what I did," I've lost almost everything, and I want to make things right. Besides, you'll need my help. The people who took over are ruthless, Grace scoffed. Help? After everything you've done? You expect me to trust you? You don't have to trust me, Mason replied. But you'll need me. After Mason left, Grace slumped onto the couch, her mind racing. Oliver sat beside her, his expression unreadable. What do you think? Grace asked, her voice quiet. I think he's hiding something, Oliver said. And I don't trust him. Neither do I, Grace admitted. But if what he's saying is true, I can't just ignore it. Oliver took her hand. If you want to pursue this, I'll support you. But promise me you'll be careful. Mason's motives might not be as noble as he claims. Grace nodded, a spark of determination in her eyes. I have to know the truth, Oliver. I owe that to my father. The next day, Oliver assembled his legal team, instructing them to investigate the alleged fraud. Meanwhile, Grace dove into her father's old records, poring over contracts, letters, and receipts. The task was emotionally draining, each piece of paper a reminder of what she had lost. Among the documents, she found a note from her father, written shortly before his death. It read, "The legacy isn't in the art. It's in the people who carry it forward. Don't let anyone take that from you, Grace." The words reignited her resolve. This wasn't just about reclaiming the estate. It was about honoring her father's memory. Oliver's legal team soon uncovered damning evidence. The fraudulent takeover was orchestrated by a corporate tycoon named Gerald Whitmore, a man notorious for his shady dealings. The deeper they dug, the more corruption they uncovered: bribes, forged documents, and illegal transfers. Vanessa, Oliver's assistant, took a particular interest in the case. "This guy Whitmore has a lot of skeletons in his closet," she said during a briefing. "But going after him won't be easy. He's well-connected and ruthless." "That's never stopped us before," Oliver replied. "Keep digging." As the investigation progressed, Mason reappeared, claiming to have critical information about Whitmore's operations. Grace was skeptical, but agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Mason arrived late, his usual smugness tempered by unease. "I have something you'll want to see," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Grace opened it to find a series of emails and financial records implicating Whitmore in the fraud. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked, her tone wary. "Because I want to help," Mason said. "And because I owe you." Grace studied him, searching for any sign of deceit. "If I find out you're playing me—" "You won't," Mason interrupted. "I'm not that guy anymore." Armed with new evidence, Grace and Oliver's team prepared to file a lawsuit against Whitmore. The stakes were high, and the risks even higher. Whitmore wasn't the type to back down without a fight. Late one evening, as Grace and Oliver reviewed the case, she looked up at him. "Why are you doing this, Oliver? You don't owe me anything." Oliver met her gaze, his voice steady. "Because I believe in you, and because I know what it's like to fight for something that matters." Grace's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. The chapter ends with a symbolic moment. Grace standing in front of her father's old estate, the wind rustling through the overgrown gardens. Oliver stands beside her, his presence a silent reminder that she's no longer fighting alone. "This is just the beginning," Grace says, her voice filled with determination. Oliver nods, "And we'll face it together." As they turn to leave, the camera pans to a figure watching them from a distance, a shadowy reminder that their fight is far from over. The city skyline was veiled in a blanket of gray as Grace paced the penthouse, her nerves a storm of uncertainty. The revelations about her father's legacy and Mason's betrayal played on a loop in her mind. Every document she read, every piece of evidence Oliver's team uncovered, brought her closer to the truth, but also deeper into a tangled web of lies. Oliver returned from his office late that evening, carrying a folder thick with new findings. His face was serious, but his eyes held the quiet determination that Grace had come to rely on. "You're not going to believe this," he said, setting the folder on the table. "Whitmore didn't just steal the estate. He used it as collateral to fund a massive illegal operation." Grace frowned, flipping through the documents. "What kind of operation?" "Money laundering, mostly," Oliver replied. "But there's more. His network is tied to high-profile figures, politicians, business tycoons, even law enforcement." Grace's breath caught. "You're saying this isn't just about my father's estate?" Oliver nodded grimly. "This is bigger than we thought." The enormity of the situation weighed heavily on Grace. She spent days immersed in the investigation, fueled by a mix of anger and determination. Oliver stayed by her side, offering quiet encouragement when she faltered. "You don't have to do this alone," he reminded her one evening, his voice steady but gentle. Grace looked up from the documents spread across the table. "I know. But this is my fight, Oliver. My father's fight." Oliver smiled faintly. "Then let's make it our fight." Together, they mapped out a plan. Oliver's legal team would focus on building an airtight case against Whitmore, while Grace would gather additional evidence, letters, sketches, anything that might prove her father's rightful ownership of the estate. Vanessa, Oliver's razor-sharp assistant, emerged as an invaluable ally. Late one night, she called Oliver with a critical update. "I've found a digital trail," she said, her voice buzzing with excitement. "Emails, offshore accounts, even encrypted messages. Whitmore's network is more extensive than we thought." "Can you trace it all?" Oliver asked. "It'll take time. But yes," Vanessa replied. "This could be the smoking gun we need." The next morning, Vanessa presented her findings to Grace and Oliver. The evidence was damning, proof of fraudulent transactions, bribes, and even threats made to silence whistleblowers. "This could take him down," Grace said, her voice tinged with both hope and apprehension. "If we're smart about it," Vanessa cautioned. "Whitmore isn't going to go quietly." As the case gained momentum, Grace found herself grappling with a flood of emotions. Memories of her father, his laughter, his unwavering belief in her, surfaced at unexpected moments. One afternoon, while sifting through a box of his belongings, she found an old journal. Inside were sketches of the estate, accompanied by notes about his dreams for its future. "This wasn't just a business to him," Grace said softly, showing the journal to Oliver. "It was his life's work." Oliver placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then, let's make sure the world knows that." With Vanessa's evidence in hand, Oliver's team prepared to launch the first legal strike against Whitmore. The lawsuit was filed, and the media was tipped off. Within hours, headlines blared. "Heir to Donovan Empire seeks justice against corporate mogul." The public reaction was immediate and polarizing. Some saw Grace as a courageous underdog, fighting for her family's legacy. Others dismissed her as a gold digger chasing a payday. The scrutiny was intense, but Grace stood firm. "This isn't about me," she told a reporter during a brief interview. "It's about righting a wrong that's gone unpunished for too long." Not everyone was convinced of Grace's motives. Mason, ever the opportunist, began planting seeds of doubt in the media. "She's always been headstrong," he said during an interview. "I just hope she knows what she's getting herself into." Grace watched the segment with clenched fists. He's trying to discredit me, she said, her voice shaking with anger. Let him talk, Oliver said calmly. The truth will speak louder than anything he says. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that Mason's interference was just the beginning. One evening, while reviewing Vanessa's latest findings, Grace stumbled upon something chilling. A series of encrypted messages between Whitmore and an unknown associate. The messages hinted at a plan to neutralize the threat posed by Grace's lawsuit. She showed the messages to Oliver, her hands trembling. They're talking about me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Oliver's expression darkened. We need to increase security. Over the next few days, Oliver hired private security to ensure Grace's safety. Despite the precautions, the sense of danger loomed large, casting a shadow over their every move. Amid the chaos, Oliver surprised Grace with a visit to her father's old estate. The property, though neglected and overgrown, still held an undeniable beauty. I thought you could use a reminder of what you're fighting for, Oliver said as they walked through the grounds. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she took in the sight. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. This means more than I can say. They spent the afternoon exploring the estate, imagining what it could become once it was restored. The visit renewed Grace's resolve, giving her the strength to keep fighting. The city was shrouded in a cold, early winter morning mist as Grace stared at the envelope in her hands. The anonymous note from the night before felt heavier than it should, each word etched into her mind. You're getting too close. Back off, or there will be consequences. The warning was unmistakable, but it only solidified her resolve. Whoever had sent it underestimated her determination. Oliver entered the room, his expression taut with focus. The security team is investigating the source of the note, he said. In the meantime, we don't take any chances. Vanessa's set up a secure meeting with Mason. Grace clenched her jaw at the mention of her brother. The betrayal was still fresh, but the need for answers outweighed her personal hurt. Let's do it, she said, her voice steady. The meeting took place in a private conference room at Oliver's office, the walls adorned with sleek, modern art that felt out of place given the tension in the air. Mason was already seated when Grace and Oliver arrived. He greeted them with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Grace, he said, spreading his hands in mock sincerity. I was hoping we could talk. Grace sat across from him, her posture rigid. Talk? Or lie some more? Mason sighed, leaning back in his chair. I made mistakes, I admit that. But I was under a lot of pressure. You have no idea what it was like after Dad died. Don't you dare play the victim, Grace snapped. You stole from us, from me. Oliver placed a calming hand on her arm, a silent reminder to stay composed. We're not here to rehash the past, Mason. We're here to figure out where we go from here. Mason hesitated, the bravado slipping from his face. Look, Whitmore approached me after Dad passed. He offered a deal that sounded too good to refuse. I thought I was protecting the family. Protecting the family? Grace's voice cracked with disbelief. You sold everything he built. I didn't know it would spiral like this, Mason said, his voice softening. By the time I realized what Whitmore was really after, it was too late. He threatened me, Grace, said he'd ruin me. And you. The room fell silent, Mason's words hanging heavy in the air. Grace struggled to process the mixture of betrayal and fear. You could have told me, she said finally, her voice trembling. We could have fought him together. Mason looked down, unable to meet her gaze. I was scared. The conversation shifted as Oliver presented the evidence they'd gathered. Mason, We're building a case against Whitmore, but we need everything you have. Emails, contracts, anything. Mason hesitated, his loyalty to Whitmore clearly wavering. If I help you, he'll come after me. He already is, Grace said firmly, holding up the anonymous note. This isn't just about me anymore, Mason. It's about justice for Dad. And for everyone Whitmore has hurt. After a long pause, Mason nodded. I'll give you what I have. But you have to promise to protect me. You're doing the right thing, Oliver said, his tone neutral but resolute. The meeting ended with Mason handing over a USB drive filled with incriminating documents. As he left the room, Grace felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Do you think he's telling the truth? She asked Oliver. We'll find out, he replied. But either way, we're one step closer. Over the next few days, Grace and Oliver pored over the files. The information was a treasure trove of damning evidence, fraudulent contracts, bank transfers, and correspondences that implicated Whitmore and his associates. As the case gained traction, Grace found herself reflecting on her own journey. One evening, she visited her father's grave, a simple headstone in a quiet cemetery. She knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the engraved letters. I'm sorry I let it get this far, Dad, she whispered, but I promise I'm going to make it right. The visit was cathartic, giving her a renewed sense of purpose. When she returned to the penthouse, Oliver noticed the change in her demeanor. You seem lighter, he remarked. I am, she said with a small smile. For the first time, I feel like I'm not carrying this alone. As news of their lawsuit spread, public interest in Grace's story exploded. Interviews, op-eds, and debates about her motives dominated the media. Grace agreed to a live interview, hoping to shift the narrative. The host, a sharp-eyed journalist named Julia Sanders, didn't hold back. Some say this is a personal vendetta, disguised as a fight for justice. What do you say to that? Grace met her gaze without hesitation. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. My father believed in integrity, and I won't let his legacy be tarnished. The interview was a turning point, earning Grace both admiration and criticism. But more importantly, it rallied support for her cause. The chapter closes with a tense scene at Whitmore's headquarters. A shadowy figure enters his office, handing him a file marked with Grace's name. She's not backing down, the figure said. Whitmore's lips curled into a sinister smile. Then we'll have to remind her what's at stake. Back at the penthouse, Grace receives another anonymous message, this time more threatening. You think you've won. This isn't over. Oliver reads the message over her shoulder, his expression dark. They're scared, he said, echoing his earlier sentiment. That means we're winning. But Grace knows the battle is far from over. As she looks out at the city lights, her determination hardens. No matter the cost, she's ready to face whatever comes next. The first light of dawn illuminated Chicago's towering skyline. But Grace Donovan hadn't slept. Sitting at the kitchen counter in Oliver Harrington's penthouse, she stared at a thick stack of legal documents, her fingers tracing the edge of a folder marked Donovan versus Whitmore Industries. The lawsuit had officially been filed, and with it came an onslaught of challenges that neither Grace nor Oliver could have fully anticipated. Oliver entered the room, already dressed in his tailored suit, coffee in hand. He placed a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. You need to rest, he said softly. You've been at this all night. Grace shook her head. How can I rest when every move we make feels like stepping onto a battlefield? You're not in this alone, Oliver reminded her, his voice steady. We're a team. But even as he said it, Grace could sense the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. The stakes were higher than ever, and the opposition was formidable. The lawsuit's filing was met with immediate retaliation. Within hours, Whitmore Industries released a statement dismissing Grace's claims as baseless and accusing her of defamation. The media lapped it up, painting a picture of a scrappy underdog fighting a corporate giant. "That's exactly what we are," Oliver said during a strategy meeting with their legal team. "And that's how we'll win. But we need to stay one step ahead." Vanessa, Oliver's ever-efficient assistant, chimed in. "I've been digging through Whitmore's public filings and corporate history. There's a pattern of fraudulent acquisitions and buried lawsuits. If we can expose that, we'll weaken their position." "Good," Oliver said, nodding. "But be careful. Whitmore doesn't play fair." Vanessa's dedication impressed Grace. Over the past weeks, she had come to respect the sharp, no-nonsense woman who seemed to anticipate problems before they arose. "Thank you, Vanessa," Grace said sincerely, "for believing in this fight." Vanessa gave her a rare smile. Someone needs to remind these guys that the truth still matters. The retaliation wasn't limited to public statements. Anonymous emails flooded Oliver's inbox, warning him to drop the case. One morning, the penthouse's security system detected a breach attempt. Though nothing was stolen, the message was clear. Whitmore's people wanted them to feel vulnerable. "I've increased security," Oliver told Grace as they reviewed the day's developments. "But we need to stay vigilant." Grace's resolve hardened. "Let them try to scare me. I'm not backing down." The tension between them simmered as the pressure mounted. Grace worried about the strain this was putting on Oliver. Despite his assurances, she could see the toll it was taking on him. His late nights at the office, the endless calls with lawyers and investors. Yet he never faltered in his support for her. A breakthrough came when Vanessa discovered a series of hidden transactions between Whitmore Industries and a shell company tied to overseas accounts. The transfers coincided with a timeline of Grace's family estate's fraudulent sale. "This is it," Vanessa announced during a late-night meeting at Oliver's office. "This could prove they laundered money to secure the takeover." Oliver's legal team moved quickly, filing a motion to subpoena additional records. The news spread rapidly, shaking Whitmore's confidence. But with progress came a new wave of threats. One evening, Grace found an envelope slipped under the door of the penthouse. Inside was a handwritten note. "You don't know what you're getting into. Drop this, or you'll regret it." The note chilled her, but it also stoked her determination. She handed it to Oliver, who read it with a grim expression. "They're getting desperate," he said. "Good," Grace replied. "That means we're making progress." Still, the threat unsettled her. That night, as she lay awake in bed, she thought about the cost of this fight. Not just for her, but for Oliver and everyone else involved. Was it worth it? Despite the threats, Grace's story began to resonate with the public. Social media buzzed with support for her fight against Whitmore. Hashtags like #JusticeForDonovan trended, and people shared stories of their own struggles against powerful corporations. "I never expected people to care this much," Grace admitted during a quiet moment with Oliver. "They care because you're fighting for something bigger than yourself," Oliver said. "You're giving them hope." The momentum lifted Grace's spirits, but it also made her more determined to see this through. The public was watching, and she couldn't afford to fail. As the lawsuit progressed, Vanessa unearthed a shocking piece of evidence. A letter written by Grace's father shortly before his death. The letter, addressed to Grace, hinted at a larger conspiracy involving Whitmore and several other powerful entities. "He knew something," Grace said, her voice trembling as she read the letter. "He tried to warn me." The discovery added a new layer of urgency to their case. If they could connect the dots, it might not just win them the lawsuit, it could expose an entire network of corruption. The pressure began to take a toll on Grace and Oliver's relationship. One evening, after a particularly heated exchange about their legal strategy, Grace lashed out. "Maybe I'm dragging you into something you shouldn't be part of." Oliver's voice was calm but firm. "This isn't just your fight, Grace. It's ours, and I'm not going anywhere." Grace sighed, her frustration giving way to guilt. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. I'm scared." "I know," Oliver replied, pulling her into an embrace. "But we're stronger together." As the chapter closed, the lawsuit reached a critical juncture. The court scheduled a preliminary hearing to determine whether the case would proceed to trial. Whitmore's legal team filed a motion to dismiss, while Grace and Oliver's team prepared their counterarguments. The night before the hearing, Grace stood on the penthouse balcony, looking out over the city. Oliver joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I am," she said, her voice steady. "For Dad, for us, for everyone who's ever been silenced." The next morning, as they entered the courthouse, the weight of their fight pressed down on them. But as they took their seats, Grace felt a surge of strength. She wasn't alone, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the opulent world Oliver and Grace had grown accustomed to. Hardwood benches, a judge presiding from a raised dais, and the sterile hum of fluorescent lights cast a somber atmosphere over the proceedings. The preliminary hearing was the first real battle in their war against Whitmore Industries. Grace sat beside Oliver, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The tension was palpable as their lawyer, Thomas Crane, presented their case. Opposite them, Whitmore's legal team exuded an air of smug confidence, their lead attorney delivering a scathing argument to dismiss the lawsuit. Grace's heart raced as she glanced at Oliver, his calm demeanor masking the storm she knew was brewing inside him. She admired his resolve, but a gnawing guilt whispered that she was dragging him down. The media circus outside the courthouse was relentless. Photographers jostled for position, shouting questions as Grace and Oliver exited. Despite their legal team's attempts to shield them, snippets of their story had leaked, fueling wild speculation and sensational headlines. "Grace, is it true you're only after his money?" one reporter shouted. "Oliver, do you regret standing by her?" asked another. Oliver's hand tightened around Grace's as they pushed through the throng. "Ignore them," he whispered. "They don't know us." But Grace couldn't ignore the doubt creeping into her mind. The constant scrutiny was eroding her confidence, and she began questioning whether their relationship could withstand the strain. At the penthouse, the stress boiled over into an argument. "This is tearing your life apart," Grace exclaimed, pacing the living room. "So, your investors are skittish. Your board is questioning your judgment. I can't let you sacrifice everything for me." Oliver stood firm, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm not sacrificing anything. I'm fighting for something I believe in, you." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "But what if it's not enough? What if I'm not enough?" Oliver stepped closer, taking her hands. "You are more than enough, Grace. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Despite his reassurances, the rift between them deepened. Grace's fear of being a burden clashed with Oliver's unwavering determination to support her, creating a chasm that neither knew how to bridge. One evening, as the city lights twinkled outside the penthouse, Oliver decided it was time to act. He had been planning this moment for weeks, but the timing felt right now, not because of the pressure, but because he needed Grace to know how much she meant to him. He led her to the balcony. the crisp night air wrapping around them. "Grace," he began, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "When I met you, I thought I had everything, but you showed me how hollow my life was. You made me see what really matters." Grace looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "Oliver, what are you saying?" He dropped to one knee, pulling a velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a simple yet elegant diamond ring. "I'm saying I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks as she nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes, Oliver. Yes, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger, pulling her into a tight embrace, as applause erupted from the street below, where onlookers had gathered to witness the romantic moment. The engagement marked a shift in public perception. What had been a scandalous story about a billionaire and a homeless woman transformed into a tale of love and redemption. Social media lit up with messages of support, and even some of Oliver's most skeptical investors began to see the humanity behind his actions. Grace, however, struggled to embrace the newfound attention. She felt undeserving of the praise and worried about the heightened expectations. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," Oliver told her during a quiet moment. "You've already shown the world who you are, a fighter." The engagement also galvanized Grace's determination to see the lawsuit through. With renewed vigor, she threw herself into the fight, attending strategy sessions and even speaking at a press conference to share her story. "For years, I let fear dictate my choices," she told reporters, her voice steady despite the camera flashes. "But no more. This isn't just about reclaiming what was taken from me. It's about standing up for what's right." Her words resonated with the public, and support for their cause grew. Donations poured into a crowdfunding campaign to cover legal fees, and advocacy groups rallied behind her. As the trial date approached, the pressure reached a boiling point. Grace's insecurities flared, and she began to pull away from Oliver, convinced she was holding him back. One evening she packed a bag and prepared to leave. "I can't do this to you," she said, tears streaming down her face as Oliver found her at the door. "You deserve someone who isn't dragging you down." Oliver blocked her path, his eyes blazing with determination. "You don't get to decide that. I chose you, Grace, and I'm not letting you go." His words broke through her defenses, and she collapsed into his arms, sobbing. "I'm so scared, Oliver." "I know," he said, holding her tightly, "but we'll face this together, always." Their reconciliation strengthened their bond, and they faced the final weeks before the trial. As a united front, Oliver surprised Grace with a small celebration, inviting close friends and allies to toast their engagement and rally support for their cause. Vanessa, who had become a steadfast ally, raised her glass during a heartfelt toast. "To Grace and Oliver, proof that love and determination can overcome anything." The courtroom was electric with tension. The trial had drawn immense public attention, and every seat in the gallery was filled with reporters, legal experts, and supporters of both sides. Cameras flashed as Grace and Oliver entered together, a united front against Whitmore Industries. Thomas Crane, their sharp and seasoned attorney, began the opening arguments. "This is not just a case about wealth or power. It is about justice for a woman who was robbed of her family's legacy. It is about righting a wrong that should never have occurred." The opposing counsel, representing Whitmore, countered with their own narrative, painting Grace as an opportunist and questioning the validity of her claim. Grace sat stiffly beside Oliver, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. Every word spoken felt like a blow, but she drew strength from Oliver's presence. He placed a reassuring hand over hers, his silent promise of unwavering support. Day by day, the trial unfolded, each session more intense than the last. Thomas presented evidence meticulously uncovered by Oliver's legal team. Fraudulent documents, email correspondence between Mason and Whitmore executives, and testimony from former employees who had been silenced. The pivotal moment came when a damning piece of evidence was revealed, a ledger detailing payments made to Mason for orchestrating the fraudulent sale of the Donovan estate. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as the document was displayed on the large screen for all to see. The opposing counsel scrambled to refute the claims, but their arguments began to unravel under the weight of the evidence. Each new revelation brought Grace closer to reclaiming what was rightfully hers. Grace's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. Taking the stand, she recounted her family's history, the betrayal by her brother, and the years of struggle that followed. Her voice trembled at times, but her resolve never wavered. "My father built that estate with his own hands," she said, her gaze steady as she addressed the jury. "It wasn't just a business. It was our home, our legacy. Losing it wasn't just losing a place. It was losing a part of who I was." Her words moved many in the courtroom, even some who had been skeptical of her motives. Oliver watched from the gallery, pride swelling in his chest. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, strong, resilient, and unyielding in the face of adversity. The defense called Mason to the stand, hoping to discredit Grace's claims. Dressed in a sharp suit, Mason tried to appear confident, but the pressure of the trial weighed heavily on him. Under cross-examination, Thomas relentlessly dismantled Mason's testimony, exposing contradictions and forcing him to admit his role in the fraudulent sale. Mason's attempts to deflect blame only further incriminated him. "Mr. Donovan," Thomas said, his tone cutting, "did you or did you not accept payment to facilitate the sale of your family's estate to Whitmore Industries?" Mason hesitated, his eyes darting to the defense table, before he finally muttered, "Yes." The courtroom erupted in whispers, the weight of his confession sealing the fate of Whitmore's defense. After weeks of intense proceedings, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman read the decision. "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Grace Donovan." Cheers erupted from the gallery, and Grace felt tears stream down her face as the judge declared the estate officially restored to her name. Oliver pulled her into a tight embrace, his voice a whisper in her ear. "You did it." The public response was overwhelming. Grace's victory became a symbol of resilience and justice. Her story, inspiring countless others to stand up against corruption and fight for what was right. With the trial behind them, Grace and Oliver faced the media together. At a press conference, Grace spoke candidly about her journey. "This wasn't just about reclaiming my family's estate," she said, her voice steady despite the camera flashes. "It was about standing up to those who thought they could take what didn't belong to them. It was about finding my voice again." Oliver stood beside her, his arm around her waist. "I'm proud of Grace, not just for what she's achieved, but for the courage she's shown throughout this fight." The press conference marked a turning point in public perception. Articles that once criticized Grace now celebrated her as a beacon of strength and determination. As they toured the newly reclaimed estate, Grace and Oliver discussed their plans to transform it into a community arts center. The idea was born from Grace's love of art and her desire to give others the opportunities she once lost. "This place should be more than a reminder of the past," Grace said, her voice filled with purpose. "It should be a place where people can dream, create, and rebuild." Oliver nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. "It's perfect, just like you." Work on the Arts Center began immediately. with Grace at the helm. She oversaw every detail, from the restoration of the building to the creation of workshops and galleries for local artists. To celebrate their victory, Grace and Oliver hosted a gala at the estate, inviting friends, supporters, and members of the community. The event was both a celebration of their journey and a fundraiser for the Arts Center. As they danced under the glittering chandeliers, Grace felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. "We've come so far," she said, looking up at Oliver. "And we're just getting started," he replied, pulling her closer. As the night wound down, a mysterious guest approached Grace, handing her a note before disappearing into the crowd. The note read, "Congratulations on your victory, but there are still truths you haven't uncovered. Be careful who you trust." Grace felt a chill run down her spine as she shared the note with Oliver. "What do you think it means?" she asked. He frowned, his protective instincts kicking in. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." The morning sunlight filtered through the grand windows of the restored Donovan estate. The soft glow illuminated the delicate lace decorations hanging from the chandeliers, creating an ethereal atmosphere inside the estate's ballroom. Oliver stood at the front of the room, looking out at the lavish setting. It had been months since they had started the long process of restoring the estate, and now it was ready for the most significant event of their lives. Today, he was marrying Grace Donovan. Grace stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bridal suite, her heart racing with excitement. The wedding gown, a simple yet elegant design, fit perfectly, the lace hugging her figure just right. She turned from side to side, catching glimpses of herself in the mirror, unsure whether the woman staring back was truly her. After everything that had happened, the trials, the betrayals, the public scrutiny, she could hardly believe that this day had arrived. Lily, her closest friend and now maid of honor, stood behind her, adjusting the veil. "You look stunning, Grace. You're about to marry a man who loves you like no one else ever could." Grace smiled softly, her hand gently tracing the fabric of her gown. "I never thought I'd get here, you know. When I was out on the streets, I never even dreamed of a day like this." Lily turned her around, fixing Grace's veil before placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You've fought for this. You've earned it." She paused for a moment, her eyes glistening with tears. "And Oliver, he'll stand by you forever." Grace took a deep breath, her chest tightening with emotion. She had come so far, not just in terms of her career or the estate she had reclaimed, but in terms of her own growth. The woman standing before her in the mirror was no longer the vulnerable artist who had been betrayed by family and life. She was someone new, stronger, more confident, and deeply in love. Downstairs, Oliver paced nervously. He had known Grace for months now, and in that time, they had faced everything together. Public judgment, media scrutiny, and even threats to their lives. But standing here today, he felt a different kind of pressure. This wasn't a business deal. It wasn't about the estate or the corporate world he knew so well. This was about love. This was about Grace. And that terrified him in a way he couldn't explain. He had faced countless board meetings, made million-dollar deals, and walked into rooms with the most powerful people in the world without breaking a sweat. But now, in the quiet moments before his wedding, every doubt he had about himself crept into his mind. Was he truly worthy of her? Was he the man she deserved? Would he be enough? "Oliver, she's ready." Vanessa, his assistant, appeared at the door, her voice breaking through his racing thoughts. "She's waiting for you." Oliver nodded, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Vanessa." He walked out of the room, his steps slow but deliberate. He made his way down the hallway of the Donovan estate, which now felt more like a home than a relic of a past he wasn't sure he belonged to. The grand staircase, the polished wood floors, and the intricate paintings on the walls, they all seemed to fade away as his thoughts centered on the woman who was about to become his wife. At the end of the hallway he saw her, Grace. She stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at him with a gaze that stole his breath away. He had seen her in countless situations, through tears and laughter, through moments of despair and joy, but nothing compared to the beauty of this moment. The woman he loved, the woman who had fought for everything, now stood before him, about to join him in a life that neither of them had expected. The wedding march played softly in the background, but for Oliver, the sound of Grace's soft steps was all that mattered. She descended slowly, her veil flowing behind her like a delicate cloud. The crowd of family, friends, and those who had supported them throughout the ordeal faded into the background. All that existed in the room was Oliver and Grace, and everything that had led them to this moment. As Grace reached the bottom of the stairs, Oliver's heart swelled with emotion. He reached out his hand, and she took it with a look that told him she was ready for this new chapter in their lives. They walked together toward the altar, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating as one. The officiant, a close friend of Grace's, began the ceremony. The words of love and commitment were familiar, but to Grace, they felt brand new. Every promise made today was one she had never imagined she would be able to make. She had lived through betrayal, hardship, and loss. But today, she was standing before the man who had given her a future she never thought possible. Do you, Grace Donovan, take Oliver Harrington to be your lawfully wedded husband? The officiant asked. Grace smiled through the tears that threatened to spill. I do. And do you, Oliver Harrington, take Grace Donovan to be your lawfully wedded wife? Oliver's voice was steady, unwavering. I do. The officiant declared them husband and wife, and the room erupted into applause. Oliver leaned forward and kissed Grace gently, sealing their vows with a tenderness that spoke volumes. The sound of the crowd's cheers faded into the background as the two of them embraced, their love more evident than ever. Later that evening, as the celebration continued, Oliver and Grace shared a quiet moment away from the festivities. They stood on the balcony of the estate, looking out at the stars above. The night felt peaceful, calm, almost surreal. We did it, Grace whispered, her head resting on Oliver's shoulder. I can't believe we made it here. Oliver kissed the top of her head, his arm around her. We've come so far, Grace. And this is just the beginning. Grace smiled softly. I never thought I'd find someone who would stand by me through everything. But here you are. And I'll always be here, Oliver replied, his voice full of conviction. I'll stand by you, no matter what comes next. The future stretched out before them, a world of possibilities. And as they stood together in the quiet of the night, it was clear that nothing could break their bond. Together, they had faced the storm, and now they were ready for whatever life had in store. The weeks following the wedding had been a whirlwind. Grace and Oliver were both entrenched in their respective roles. But now, with the Donovan estate finally restored to Grace's name, their focus had shifted to a new challenge. Grace was no longer just a woman recovering from betrayal. She was a leader, an advocate for others who had been discarded by society. And yet, as she stood on the balcony of their penthouse, watching the skyline of New York City, a nagging feeling lingered at the back of her mind. Things were too peaceful. Everything had come together so perfectly, but she couldn't shake the sensation that the storm was far from over. Grace. Oliver's voice brought her out of her thoughts. He stepped out onto the balcony, joining her in the cool evening air. He wore a tired expression, but smiled when their eyes met. "Hey," Grace replied softly, turning to face him. Her voice carried a mixture of concern and fatigue. "Is everything okay?" Oliver rubbed his forehead, his brow furrowed in frustration. "We're about to face something we didn't expect." She raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms as she leaned against the railing. "What do you mean?" "A new threat," he said, his voice lower, more intense. "Someone connected to the corporation we took down has been reaching out. They're not happy with the way things have turned out. We thought we had everything under control, but this feels like something bigger." Grace's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped that with the estate's return, things would calm down. But Oliver's words brought the reality of their situation back to the forefront. They weren't just fighting for a legacy. They were fighting for their lives, for everything they had built together. "We'll handle it," Grace said firmly, her tone unwavering. "We've faced worse." Oliver didn't respond immediately, but his eyes softened as he looked at her. "I'm not worried about me," he said quietly. "I'm worried about you." Grace reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "Don't worry about me," she whispered. "We're in this together, and nothing's going to tear us apart." The night wore on, in a heavy silence. They both knew that whatever this new threat was, it would test everything they had fought for. But there was no turning back now. The battle was far from over, and they would face it side by side. The next day, Oliver and Grace sat in the conference room of their building, reviewing the details of the information they had received. The threat was more serious than they had originally thought. A mysterious guest had shown up at the estate's grand opening. A man they had never seen before. Someone who appeared to have a direct link to the corporate world they had dismantled. His presence was no coincidence, and it sent a ripple of unease through Grace's chest. The door to the conference room opened, and Vanessa, Oliver's trusted assistant, stepped inside, carrying a file in her hand. She had always been the calm, collected one in their organization. But today, there was an edge to her expression that made Grace's heart race. "We need to talk," Vanessa said, her voice tense. She placed the file on the table, her gaze flicking between Grace and Oliver. "The man who appeared at the event. His name is Gregory Mason. He's one of the key players behind the fraudulent takeover of the Donovan estate. We've got a problem." Oliver leaned forward, his fingers pressing into the surface of the table. "What kind of problem?" Vanessa hesitated before answering. "Gregory Mason has connections to some of the most powerful people in the city. He's not just a businessman. He's involved in a network that's been undermining you for months. This isn't just a personal vendetta. It's a much larger power play, and they're not going to stop until they've crushed you." Grace's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the final challenge. She had been expecting something like this, but knowing it was finally here made her feel like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "How do we fight this?" Grace asked, her voice steady but laced with determination. Oliver's eyes darkened with resolve. "We fight with everything we have. We've already exposed their lies, but now we take them down for good. This time it's not just about the estate. It's about protecting everything we've built, the people we've helped, the foundation we've created. We can't let them tear that down." Vanessa nodded, handing them the file. "I've gathered everything we need. It's time to hit back. But we need to be careful. Gregory Mason won't go down without a fight." Grace flipped open the file, her eyes scanning the documents quickly. Everything they needed was right there. Proof of corruption, connections to organized crime, financial records showing the extent of the manipulation. But it wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed to find the final piece of the puzzle that would bring everything crashing down. "I'm in," Grace said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "Let's do to this." Later that evening, the two of them stood in front of a group of trusted allies: Vanessa, a few key members from the legal team, and some people from the community who had supported them from the beginning. Grace could feel the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders, but she also felt the power of unity. They weren't just fighting for their own survival anymore. They were fighting for justice, for every person who had been wronged by the system that had failed them. "This isn't just about taking down Gregory Mason," Grace said, her voice strong and clear. "This is about standing up to the corruption that has plagued our world for too long. It's about taking back what's rightfully ours and what's rightfully yours." Oliver stood beside her, his presence a steady reassurance. "We've come too far to back down now. We fight for everything we believe in together." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time in a long while, Grace felt the warmth of her own strength. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. She had found her voice, and she would use it to bring about the change they had always dreamed of. But as the applause died down, Grace's thoughts returned to the looming danger. She knew the battle ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. There would be sacrifices, pain, and heartache, but they would face it together. The weeks after the showdown had passed in a blur. Grace and Oliver had become accustomed to their new roles, navigating a complicated web of public scrutiny and legal battles. But the silence that followed was deafening. It felt like the calm before the storm, or perhaps the final chapter of their struggle. Grace sat in the middle of their shared office space, staring at the community center's design plans, but her mind was elsewhere. She was no longer just the woman who had lost everything. She had become someone new, someone with a purpose. The foundation had grown exponentially, but now it was time for her to take the final step. A few months ago, she would have never imagined herself in this position. Yet here she was, making decisions for thousands of people, giving them the second chances they so desperately needed. "Grace, I think it's time." Vanessa's voice broke through her thoughts. Grace looked up from the table to see Vanessa standing in the doorway. Her assistant's ever-calm demeanor was replaced by a hint of excitement. "Time for what?" Grace asked, wiping a stray hair from her face as she stood up, walking over to Vanessa. "We're ready," Vanessa said, holding up a set of documents. "We have all the final approvals for the expansion. The first new center will be up and running next month." Grace's heart raced. This was it. This was the beginning of the end. Of the fight, of the pain, of everything she'd struggled with. The new community center was more than just a building. It was the legacy her father had dreamed of, and the promise of a new future. But as she looked at the papers, she knew it was more than that. It was proof of her strength. Proof that she had made it through everything that had tried to destroy her. "Where do we go from here?" Grace asked, her voice barely a whisper. Vanessa smiled. "We expand. But it's not just about the centers anymore, Grace. It's about changing the narrative, about giving people their power back." Grace nodded slowly, the weight of her new reality sinking in. But even as she stood there, a sense of unease crept into her chest. They had won the legal battle. They had reclaimed the estate, and the media had started shifting their focus from the scandal to the good they were doing. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. She had fought for the right to exist in the world of power, of wealth and influence. But that world still felt foreign to her. Even though the foundations of her life had changed, the foundation within her was still cracked, still fragile. "You're doing great," Oliver's voice came from behind her. She turned around to find him leaning in the doorway of the office, his usual confident presence softened by the concern in his eyes. He stepped inside, crossing the room to stand beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Grace smiled weakly. "It doesn't feel like enough." "It will," Oliver assured her. "It takes time. You didn't get here overnight, and you won't fix everything in a day. But I know what you're capable of." Grace's hand went instinctively to her locket, the one she had clutched so many times when things had seemed impossible. Oliver had given it back to her the day they had reclaimed the estate. She had worn it since then, but now, as her fingers brushed the cold metal, she felt the weight of it more than ever. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was a symbol of all she had lost, all she had fought for, and all she had yet to build. I wish I could see it the way you do," Grace murmured, turning to face him fully now. "I wish I could believe that everything we've built, everything we're trying to do, is enough." "You will," Oliver replied. "You've already made more of a difference than most people could dream of. You just have to let yourself believe it." Grace met his gaze, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. She could see it, the pride he felt for her, for everything she had accomplished. And yet, in the pit of her stomach, a deep fear still lingered. What if it wasn't enough? What if, despite everything, they couldn't change the system, the world they had fought so hard against? "You know," Grace said after a moment, "sometimes I feel like I'm standing at the edge of everything, but I don't know if I can take that next step." Oliver reached out and gently cupped her cheek. "Then I'll take it with you. You've never had to walk this path alone, and you never will." Her eyes softened. She knew he was right. They had faced unimaginable odds, and they had conquered them together. Still, her mind raced, wondering about the future. There was so much more to do, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on her chest. A few days later, Grace and Oliver stood before a new crowd. This time, it wasn't about the media or the courts. This time, it was about the people who had supported them all along, the people who had believed in their mission, even when the world hadn't. It was the grand opening of the first new community center, and the room was filled with warmth and excitement. Grace looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had come together to make this dream a reality. Volunteers, families, artists, and workers, each one was there because they had been touched by the work they were doing. They weren't just supporting the cause, they were part of it. She turned to Oliver, her heart swelling with gratitude. "We did it," she said softly. He smiled, his pride evident. "We did." As the ribbon was cut and the crowd erupted into applause, Grace felt a surge of emotion overwhelm her. This was her moment, the culmination of everything she had worked for. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, this was proof that change was possible, that the dream she had been chasing was no longer a dream, but a reality. Later that night, as they stood on the balcony of their penthouse, the city lights twinkling below them, Grace and Oliver reflected on the long journey that had brought them here. They had faced countless obstacles, some external, some internal, but they had made it through. And now, as they looked out at the city they had once feared, they could finally see the promise of a new beginning. Grace turned to Oliver, her voice soft, but filled with conviction. "I'm ready to build something better. For all of us." Oliver squeezed her hand, the smile on his face reflecting the future they would continue to create together. "And we will. Together." The city stretched out before them, vast and full of possibilities. The legacy they were building would not just be theirs, it would belong to every person they helped, to every family they lifted up, to every soul they inspired, for Grace, for Oliver, and for the community they had become a part of. This was only the beginning. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Grace and Oliver's story is far from over, and we hope you've felt the highs and lows with them. Their path has been one of struggle, resilience, and love, a journey that reminds us all that even in our darkest moments, there's always a chance to rebuild, to change, and to find hope again. But there's so much more to come. What will happen next in their story? How will their love continue to shape the world around them? We want to hear your thoughts and emotions. What part of their journey moved you the most? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There's so much more coming, and we promise you won't want to miss what's next. Thanks for being part of this story with us. Let's continue to inspire and uplift each other, one chapter at a time.